Welcome to PM Ready, your guide to becoming PMP certified. This is the lesson on schedule management documents. Part 2. Another schedule management document is the Milestone List. This is simply a list of all of the key project milestones or significant points or events during the life cycle of the project. These could be either mandatory milestones that are specified by the contract, or they could be other optional milestones that are interesting or significant. It may be that experience has demonstrated that this is a valuable point in a project to recognize. Keep in mind that milestones have zero duration because they represent an event, not an activity. You'll start this milestone list as you put together the project charter. But then once you're working on the project schedule in project planning, you'll want to use the milestones that were identified early on and recorded in the project charter as your starting point to develop the milestone list for your project schedule. This list of milestones may change. You may add more milestones and certainly rearrange some of the times of those that are not mandatory based on what you learn as you develop the project schedule. Once you've identified and listed all of the activities that are necessary to complete the project work, and you've identified all of the important attributes about each of those activities, then you have the information you need to put these activities into their proper order, to sequence the activities, to determine which ones are necessary to be done first, and which ones have to follow other activities, and put these into a logical order. This is called the project schedule network diagram. Here's a simple illustration of a schedule network diagram. Each of these boxes, or nodes in this diagram, labeled A, B, C, and so forth, each of these boxes represent an activity. These activities are connected with arrows from beginning to end, which indicate the order in which these activities should be done. In this illustration, it shows that tasks A, H, and K can all begin right away at the beginning of the project, but that other tasks cannot begin until those tasks are underway. Here it shows that task B can't begin until task A is finished. Also, task E can't begin until both B and D are finished. These arrows between the activities indicate the dependencies or logical relationships between these different activities. Notice that these activities do not yet have durations. We haven't gotten to the point yet of estimating how long each of these activities will take. This is important because as you look at these activities, regardless of how long they take, there are certain logical dependencies that need to be considered, identified, and recorded, and taken into account in a network diagram such as this. Some dependencies between activities are mandatory. They're just natural dependencies that exist between activities, such as when you're building a home and you need to pour the foundation and let the foundation set before you can then put up the walls. This is captured in your network diagram as a mandatory activity. You can't reasonably do this in any other order. Other dependencies are considered discretionary, often because it's best practice to do it in a certain order, but not absolutely necessary. For example, it's common practice to do the plumbing before you do the electrical work on a house. This is important for a couple of reasons. One is, of course, that it's easier to not have both of your subcontractors working in the same space at the same time. It's a lot easier if the plumber can get his job done first, and then the electrician can come in and do his job. Another reason for doing these in a certain order, it's a lot easier for the electrician to put in all of the wires after the plumbing's in place than it is to do it the other way around. And it's safer because then you don't have live electricity running through the walls while the plumber is working with water. In addition to being categorized as either mandatory or discretionary, dependencies between activities can also be categorized as either internal or external. An external dependency would be a dependency on something outside the scope and control of the project team, such as the need for the city inspector to come in and inspect the work that you've been doing. Internal dependencies are those that don't have an external constraint driving this dependency, but are driven by the project team, either because it's a mandatory requirement, such as the foundations being done before the walls, or because it's best practice, such as completing the plumbing before doing the electrical. In a schedule network diagram, there are 4 types of logical relationships between activities. The most common is the finish to start. This is when one task needs to be completed before the next one can begin. This is by far the most common type of relationship. Notice that the abbreviation for finish to start is FS. The first letter stands for the activity that comes first, and the second letter stands for the activity that comes after. So the predecessor is F and the successor is S, meaning that the predecessor has to finish before the successor can start. So that's why it's called finish to start, or FS. Another one that's not uncommon is the finish to finish. This is when 2 activities need to finish at the same time. In this type of relationship, you see these activities in which there are connectors at the end of these activities. A simple example of finish to start is that I can't install the new software on the new hardware until the new hardware is ready. An example of finish to finish is that I can't finish the documentation for a new system until the system is finished. I may be able to develop them in parallel. I may even be able to document it first to some degree, but the documentation may need some changes by the time the system is completed. So it's not really done. The documentation isn't really done until the system is finished. A start-to-start relationship is one in which 2 or more activities can or should start at the same time, or in which the start of one is based on the start of another. An example of a start-to-start relationship is when you're creating an asphalt road, and you have the crew out there, and some of them are laying down the hot asphalt, and others are following quickly behind in packing and smoothing that asphalt, which has to be done soon after it's laid down while it's still hot. So this is an example of a relationship in which these activities are going on mostly in parallel, but the start of one is based on the start of another, just slightly behind it. A start-to-finish relationship between activities is one in which the predecessor has to start before the successor can finish. This is actually a very rarely used type of relationship. In fact, I suggest that if you ever find that you have some tasks that appear to have this relationship, take a closer look at it to see if these activities aren't better represented using a finish to start by putting them in the opposite order. To summarize, finish to start relationships are by far the most common. Occasionally you'll have activities that need to finish together or start together, in which case you can use the finish to finish or start to start relationship. And start to finish is very rare and perhaps not really needed, but included for completeness. The start to finish is a relationship that is so rare you may never see it, or you may find that it's much easier to capture these relationships in other ways, and you may only ever see it on an exam and even then, it's pretty unlikely. Now it's time to talk about leads and lags. It's easiest really to start with the concept of lags first and then leads. A lag is when something can start later, and a lead is when something can start sooner and is sometimes called a negative lag. Suppose, for example, you have activities A and B with a finish to start relationship, which is the most common, but you either need or want to have some time between the finish of activity A and the start of activity B. This could be, for example, if you have a foundation that you're pouring for a house, and that foundation needs some time to cure before you start building the walls on top of it. Or you may have poured the driveway, and that needs some time to cure before you start driving on it. The pour could be represented as activity A, and then building the walls on top or driving on top could be expressed as activity B, but there needs to be some delay in between those. So you need to finish one and then wait, say, a week or more before the next activity starts. That's a 1 week lag between activities A and B. Or suppose you're building a railroad and you need to lay down rail bed first, that layer of gravel foundation. Then after that, you can put down the railroad ties. And then after that, you can put down the railroad tracks. As you're building a long railway, these tasks will be happening simultaneously, but with a little bit of lag. You can start putting down the track a little bit after you've put down the railroad ties. So you could have basically 3 crews here working in parallel, but one can start about a day after the other has been at a certain spot, and then the other can start a day after that. So these would be examples of activities that are connected start to start, but with a little bit of a lag, say 1 day, in between each of these teams' work at any point along the railway. Or using the example of the documentation of a system, once the system is finished, you may be able to finish wrapping up your final edits of the documentation within, say, 3 days after the completion of the system. So let's talk about leads. This is when something can start sooner, or also referred to as a negative lag. Using our example of the plumber and the electrician, let's suppose you still want to keep them from stepping on each other's toes and interfering with each other's work. However, you'd like to try and compress the schedule a little bit, so you have basically a finish to start relationship in which you want the plumbing done first, but if you overlap those just by a little bit, say 1 day, then you figure you're pretty safe in that the plumber will be wrapping up on one end of the house while the electrician can be starting on the other end of the house. They won't get in each other's way if they just overlap by 1 day. So that would be a finish to start -1. 1 day of lead time for the electrician to get started a day earlier than he otherwise would. Or suppose you have 2 activities that are finish to finish with a 2-day lead. For example, you may have a document that's being written and you want someone to come in and proofread it 2 days before the document is completed. Their ends are related, the finish dates of these activities are connected, but one can and should perhaps finish a couple of days before the previous one finishes. It can be a little confusing to keep leads and lags straight and which are positives and which are negatives and what this all means. But to help you with this, a lead is when you're moving a task such as task B to overlap with task A, and you're moving it to the left to make it earlier in the schedule. That is a lead, and it's always negative. So if you have a finish to start relationship, which is the most common, and you decide to overlap those by 1 day, that's not expressed as getting started on something a day earlier as a +1. It's expressed as getting started a day earlier as a -1. Because it's being moved to the left, it's negative. Similarly, for a lag, you're moving something out to the right on the schedule to make it later. You're waiting longer for something to start. In that case, you add days. So in this case, FS finish to start +5 would be waiting 5 days after the completion of activity A before you start activity B. And by the way, I've been using the word days. It doesn't have to be days. This is whatever your unit of measures is. Days is commonly used in examples, but this could be 5 days, 5 hours, 5 weeks, whatever your unit of measurement is on your schedule. When you represent these leads and lags on your network schedule, it's done by putting the type of relationship and then the lead or lag following it on the arrow in between the activities, as is shown in this simple diagram. If you start with a finish to start relationship between activity A and activity B, but then you decide you want to delay activity B by 1 day, you would add the notation to the arrow FS +1. If, on the other hand, you wanted to overlap activity B with activity A by, say, 1 day, and have activity B start a day earlier, that's represented by FS -1 written next to the arrow. It's usually a lot easier to visualize this if you actually do extend B out or overlap B, as in this case, where activity A and activity B actually show an overlap in time of those activities. You'll still generally want to put this FS -1 on the arrow, just to be clear. This simple diagram shows activity A and activity B connected with a start to start. Notice here it goes from the left side of the boxes. The left side of the box represents the start of the activity, and the right side of the box represents the end or finish of the activity. So putting the arrows on the left shows that they're connected by a start to start relationship. And then if you want to introduce a little bit of a lag, say of +1, you can slide activity B over a little bit in your diagram and add the notation SS +1 to the arrow that connects them. This diagram shows a finish-to-finish relationship between activity A and B. Note here that the arrow is connected on the right-hand side, which is the finish or end side of the activities. If you want to introduce a lag of +3, then you can move activity B over by 3, and then also add the FF +3 notation to the arrow. If, on the other hand, you want to introduce a lead in that activity B can finish 2 days before activity A finishes, then move activity B over to the left so that it shows its finish 2 days earlier, and then add the FF -2 notation. And that's it for part 2. PM Ready is a publication of PM Guaranteed and is based on the Project Management Institute's PMBOK guide.